less tolerant on the other side of your corporate IT, where you're very tolerant, because it's like take what you can get sort of thing.
Right. Lois, how about you? Anything?
Well, I was thinking like the interesting thing is this is the setup to differentiate people from things and patterns, right? And how, at least as from my perspective, my job has always been about the people, to figure out how that plays into this, right? And I loved in the Tom and Jerry part where they talk about like, well, you've got these people and they, yes, they care about their outcomes, but the experience is the thing, right? They're sensitive things, right? And they're having an experience, an emotional experience, right? Their subjective evaluation still counts. So I think as a teacher and even as a UX practitioner, when I'm trying to explain service design to UX people and they're like, well, how do they go together? And what's the difference? And, you start to talk, like for me, it's like, okay, well, people are of course part of services, right? And here's how you can think about people when you're thinking about services. You can just focus on the people, which is what we do all the time, user experience, or you can expand to think about the things and the patterns too. People still come into play. And that quote, you highlighted it, Brett, and I think too, service, what you pay for. Services are performances. Where's that thing where basically you pay for it with your experience? Outcomes are what you pay for and experience is what you pay with. Right? Like I thought that was to me, that was interesting because then it's also a way to talk to my clients about, well, how much do you want people to pay, right? With, so I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. And that's a good one. And I think it's in the book as an example. I had the opportunity to attend the 2-day training that Majid did on strategic design based on some of this stuff. And one of the examples he uses, is, flying, airline services, right? So, and he talked about, the difference between a, full service carrier and a cut rate carrier, right? I mean, yes, you pay less in money, to fly on, JetBlue or whatever, right? But the experience is awful, right? Or, and I use JetBlue as an example, but I mean, and he uses, he lives in Amsterdam, so he is using European examples. But that's the basic idea, right? You pay for an outcome, and with air travel, right? You're paying not only to get from, say, St. Louis to Washington, D.C., right? But you're also paying to get from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. on next Tuesday, and not only are you paying to get there next Tuesday, but you're paying to get there, by 7:30 in the morning so that you can be at your meeting by 9 o'clock, right? And so the more specific your outcome is, the more you're willing to pay for it, right? Because you get more value out of being there before 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning than you do, getting there at 9:30 on Tuesday night, right? But at the same time, you have an expectation of a better experience as well because you're paying more for it. If you pay, $59 on, a cut rate carrier to get somewhere early next week, right? It's going to be a whole different thing. And so, that particular quote stood out to me as well. And I think another one in leading into that, another one that I wrote down, in many cases, those paying for a service are not the ones using it. And that one really stood out to me because I've had these conversations with my team, again, in corporate IT, right? Because no one in the workforce pays for any of the tools that they use, right? But they use it, right? But someone has to pay for it. Someone is paying for it. And so the outcomes that the customer is paying for aren't always aligned with the experience that the users have of using it, right? Corporate IT is a perfect example. The focus is very generally, typically on security and low cost, right? And well, when that's, using the analogy to the airlines, when that's the outcome that you're expecting, the experience that the user of the service gets, is going to be, pretty bad sometimes. I mean, we've all dealt with corporate IT, so.
Yeah. Did you jot that down in the mural?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good one.
In many cases, those paying for a service are not the ones using it.
I remember reading that, but the way that you really compared it to like the corporate IT world is that hit home for me. So
Yeah,
good. Well done.
Well, and I think that's a good point too. Is once we get to patterns, what we'll see, one of the points that he's making, and Lois said he's building, from people to things, and then patterns, and then from patterns you'll get into actual service offerings. But a big thing, one of the real power of patterns is in analogical thinking, right? Thinking in analogies. Looking at one service and saying, oh, that's exactly the same as this. It's just different, right? I mean, it's the same pattern. So you can kind of learn from that. So.
Was he bringing that up? I mean, I understand the point, but was he bringing it up as a problem point, a pain point, or just something to observe that your services will just happen sometimes be purchased or used,
Mm-hmm.
and the people who are purchasing using them are technically using them?
Yeah, he's at this point he's just stating that. I mean, once we get into part 2, you'll see where that really comes into play, because there is a difference. So you have the provider and the customer, right? The customer pays the provider, right? And then you have users and agents, right? So the user of a service, say Spectrum Internet, right? I'm the user of Spectrum Internet, and the help desk person is the agent, right? So the agent isn't providing anything to me, but there's that relationship between the user and the provider to make the experience good, right? So at this point, he's not saying it's a pain point. He's just trying to lay the groundwork for what he builds out later.
Okay.
Anything else anyone wanted to talk about with people?
Yeah, it was really funny. I was reading it and I didn't realize it was ethnography until after I was kind of done with it, because I was looking at it as systems or processes, which my brain immediately goes to. And so things that stood out to me was one thing was the simplest of services profit. And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it just the KISS method still applies, and no matter what you do, it seems. And and then there was this other argument he was having, is the whole human nature of agency versus control, where you have to strike that balance and between how much control of the service you want to give your customer versus how much or how much agency you want to give to your customer versus how much control you want to, and where that lays out in kind of how people determine your service. And it always seems like something that sounds like something really important, like you'd always necessarily just keep in mind, but just know that tenet has to sit there. Like, because you could design an entire service, then look back and realize, well, I'm controlling everything and the customer doesn't like it, or I've given my customer too much control and I just run an anarchy over my service. It seems like a very, just like kind of almost a standard pillar of any kind of service design.
Right. Yeah, that was actually one of the notes that I wrote down in here too. It says controls often add steps to a sequence that adversely affect user experiences.
Privacy, security.
Yeah. I like how they had that pull. So I kind of, in the notes, I put like 2 arrows going in opposite directions and they're pulling against each other in the middle, and you're trying to find that middle. Or maybe not necessarily the middle isn't the right place to be.
No, I think that's good. And the other, and it comes into play between providers and customers, but also between providers and their agents, right? So Spectrum as a company, for example, provides internet service and now mobile service and all that, but they have agents, their employees, who are their face to the users and to the customers a lot of times, right? And so how much control does the provider need to exert over those agents, right? And how do you establish that relationship to make sure that the agent is acting in the provider's best interest and not the agent's best interest? Or better, how do you design the service so that the agent acting in the provider's best interest is also acting in his own best interest, right?
Yeah.
And that's,
or even has the agency to be able to act in the customer's best interest, because you could lock somebody down. So sorry, I can't. Insurance companies, I'm thinking is a big example of that one. Sorry, I can't do anything for you. You didn't sign the right policy and your house blew up. You know, but you know, it's just kind of a little extreme, but kind of that's why I can see that being a problem.
well, no, and that's the thing, and I think as I've gone through it, I mean, that's a lot of the point, is to identify all of these things, all of these points where a service can break down and not provide the outcomes that you desire and not provide the experience that's possible. You know, so that you identify these things. And that's why I appreciated this section where he defines the service and shows kind of the relationship between the people and everything. And that kind of leads me to the standout quote for me from chapter 2 about things. Was the statement that services are agreements between people about the arrangements between things.
Yeah, agreed.
That was the conclusion at the end of that discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, kind of built all the way, it built up to that, but I mean, having seen everything he did up to then, that was definitely the standout. And it, I mean, he starts the chapter with, you know, things store the potential for services. There's service potential in them all, right? So basically everything, you know, whether it's, you know, physical or virtual, tangible or intangible, you know, there's the potential for a service around it, which I thought was, you know, in hindsight seemed kind of obvious, right? But, you know, you don't necessarily think about it explicitly. I also liked, and I think Lois, I think you mentioned this at our last gathering, and Danielle as
I thought Danielle would like this too.
Yeah, as the anthropologist in the group, I'd love to hear what you think, and even Lois, your, you know, more ideas on the idea of the ethnography of things.
Yeah.
Right. And especially things like Alexa or Siri, those types of tools actually being conducting ethnographic research on us, right? The things are researching us.
I really like that description of Alexa when Majid he describes Alexa both learning from us and listening to us to suggest more things. And then it just keeps doing that in a cycle, which as the consumer, you're like, oh, hey, I do need this. And then you start thinking of things you didn't know that you needed. However, there's a financial relationship there. Like, how does Alexa know what to suggest? Like, what's number one? Like, oh, okay, there are many different possibilities. So that also is a possibility for exploitation. And I think, I love that description.
I think I was excited about like new, well, you know, I've been wanting projects that will take me into AR or VR or wearables, haptics. And so this idea that, that a thing has a valuable and useful thing that has relationships with other things. So like, if I start thinking about a watch, like an Apple Watch from that perspective, right? As a thing and what it, you know, like what does it need and how can it help, right? And almost personifying that thing, I can then think of innovative services or products associated with that thing, or especially ways for them to interact, which I think is really cool. So for me, that whole studying the social life of useful and valuable things, I feel like that could certainly be like, I, you know, for the teachers in the group, I could definitely see it as an exercise for your students. And I could see it as another approach if you were doing like a blueprint workshop or something like that, where you could be like, okay, well, let's imagine these are all things. Like, let's do an exercise. Like, I've done as part of a deliverable, like stakeholder maps, right? And you start, you draw like how they're all related to each other. Like, I could see doing a stakeholder map, but using things. I don't know. Just that got me excited.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Yeah.
and go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, taking it that same concept slightly different way. We talked about like an Apple Watch or an Alexa, which are physical products, but think about like in digital context, like a chatbot or AI. That is a digital thing that is interacting with different groups and learning and bringing all that back.
Yeah, I like the thing-centered design concept as well, just as a different lens to put on things. You're still going to bring it back to the humans that are interact with the things, but it's a different way of kind of framing the question. And it made me think of a project that we did that I certainly didn't think of it this way when I was doing it, but we were basically standing up a healthcare clinic, and within that we had 3 customer personas and 3 what they would call, not 3, probably like 5, they would call agents in here that were working in the clinic. And we had to figure out a way to basically make the clinic the center of the story, and then have all those different personas bounce in and out and connect with each other throughout that. So the thing was really that clinic, and then there were other littler things within that clinic, like a kiosk or a app for the doctor and on their phone. And would be interesting to have taken that same project and break out all the little things experiences throughout, and see how the little interactions change based on who they're interacting with, and then the context of that interaction. I thought it was an interesting way of reframing the view.
Yeah, that I mean, it kind of brings up the possibility of creating persona, for lack of a better word, a persona that is a thing, right?
Oh, yeah, he suggested that.
Yeah. And one of the common problems I have, and this is, it's not a problem I have, but it's things that people ask for, is how to handle different digital objects, right? And I'm going to have to try to, kind of like what Jake was just saying, reframe, say, a customer journey map, where the customer is the thing, right? Maybe something along those lines. I don't know. There's a lot of possibility there, though. Anything else that jumped out at anyone from chapter 2 about things?
I will say I did have some, I read through this really quickly, so maybe I didn't spend as much time as I should have trying to consume some of the details that he has there. But I did have some struggles picking up on the various, trying to figure out what the names were he had there, the definitions of.
Yeah, I'm still that way, Jake.
I'm making a chart, hopefully, just figure this out for myself. So yeah. I want to throw it up once I get it done.
And so it's the struggle I had with, the whole book, really. I every time I think I understand it, I realize that I don't. That there's just things that haven't quite gelled in my brain. Especially once you get to the later chapters, where even when we start talking about patterns, just remembering what each of the the pattern types is, and different things. So but yeah, so it definitely involves some serious learning. Yeah, like a couple. Another thing that struck me, it shouldn't need to be said, I don't think, but it probably does. It's good that he did. Is he says services make people better off, or not worse off, right? Yeah. And so, the first time I read it as services make people better off, not worse off. But then that "or" in there is important, because sometimes a service serves to keep you where you are, right? To keep you from sliding back, to basically to fight entropy, to keep you from, falling back from wherever you might have been.
Does he, since you read the book, does he use this whole coding system, this X minus all this throughout the whole book?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because I've been trying to find a way to wrap my head around it. I keep on forgetting. Then I get to refine myself. Okay, what was a fortis? What was a port?
Right.
What was the difference?
Yeah, so the y and x plus and minus is the easy stuff. That's the easy part of the coding.
Okay. Well, because like on page 45, it seems like he switches everything back up and he starts putting the x, combining x's and y's and minuses and pluses and calling them something completely different. And I'm like, wait a minute, where does this fit into everything you've been teaching us? Because he shows it and then he kind of goes back to the old system again. And I'm like, okay, what happened?
Well, and as one of my frustrations with the book, to be honest, and Matt, the other Matt, kind of hinted at this, when he was talking about reading the book, is you look at it, it's like this is different, right? I mean, it's radically crazy in terms of how he's laying these things out. And one of my personal frustrations, because I'm more of an engineer. I mean, I do good with all the fancy images and graphics, and I have great respect for those of you who can match colors and make things look really good, but that's just not me. And so when I see some of these more abstract things, they don't always work. And he in my opinion anyway, he kind of even changes, to your point, Matt, as he goes along, how he represents things, right? And one of my thoughts going through it was, why can't he just stick to one way of describing it and showing it? And I mean, it shows up at the end, right? And as you go through it, and this book, having taken the training and still communicating with Majid and some of the things he's working on, this book is really just kind of a base layer of something bigger that he's kind of building. So
because I'm looking for the equation, and the equation keeps shifting, and it's
the
analytical person in me is screaming.
Yeah.
So.
And I think the other big one that stood out to me from this, again, being a systems engineer, a systems thinker, my whole life, was the statement he writes: we also need to be able to see the concepts of a service always as a whole, problem and solution, regardless of the level of abstraction. Right? When you look at complex systems and natural systems, I mean, you see that it's no matter, they're not quite fractal, not a mathematical fractal where everything is exactly the same no matter your zoom level. But as you zoom in, a service offering is made up of several, what he calls microservices, right? And then each of those microservices is probably made up of additional microservices. And you get to a point, and this is more, I think, in the patterns chapter, where he has the write-up from Dave Hora about AWS, the web services and how those work. And Lois, I think you mentioned something at the last meeting about, I mean, that when you read it, I mean, you care to share?
Yeah, well, I was just saying that, like, his description of what AWS is, when he tried to break it down and share it as services, made so much more sense to me. Like, when he said it that way, then I was like, oh, okay. Because it's always like, it's whatever cloud services are, right? To me, it's like cloud,
right.
But then he broke it down into all these different things that were available on the cloud. And I'd had some experience with that. I've used the Google Firebase, but it was just like, oh, okay.
That's when he was describing the AWS, is that correct?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was crazy. I didn't know that the backups had backups.
Yeah.
Well, just breaking it down.
Yeah, and the way Netflix is set up, right? I mean, when you look at how Netflix works, it's easy to look at it and think, okay, yeah, it's just this website, and you go to it and you browse through all these things. But when you look at all of the smaller services that go into making up the Netflix experience, and when you realize that every person's Netflix experience is different and unique to that person, and you think about the services that run behind the scenes that then have to coordinate to present in almost real time the information that you need. I read I saw an article from the Netflix team once talking about how they how they decide which image they show, when you're scrolling through to pick what you want, what image from, the movie or whatever they show is like the poster, right? So, I may see, the dogs walking across the field, and, and Julie my wife, might see, something, different from that movie based on, what we've clicked on in the past, and, big data, machine learning, surveillance state, all that. But it's all done through, those microservices.
Wow. I didn't know there was that level of customization.
Yeah.
Well, but then I don't know if you guys try to make your map. Like, so this is where it got hard for me, because I wasn't sure what level of granularity to, like, I wanted them all to be like at the same level. And he does that in his example of AWS. They're all sort of at that same level. But that's where I found it challenging to map out my own, one of the services I experienced, because I was like, okay. And I was tempted to draw one of those flow diagrams that are shown in chapter 2. I did not do that, but I thought of it. I didn't get that far.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing, right? Is that and it kind of goes to the whole idea of the microservices. Most services are a series of steps.
Yes.
And so what stood out to me, and especially when we get into the patterns, is that in the AWS Netflix example, all of those microservices there is no hierarchy among the microservices as microservices. They only become a service offering organized in a hierarchy or a series of steps when you organize them, which goes to another key point that I wrote down, is these arrangements don't just happen, right? Someone has to make them happen. And it goes back to the basics of knowledge, right? I mean, and human networks even, right? Because just because one node in a network has a piece of information doesn't make it valuable. The value comes from when the nodes connect and share what they know, and it distributes.
Yeah.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and make the jump into chapter 3 and patterns. I think, and this is, I'm not a designer. I don't come from a design background. I know some of us on the call here do, not necessarily all of us, but the whole idea of a pattern language, spoke to me just from an engineering perspective, right? I mean, there are certain patterns that you want to always have fit together. And I know in design, I mean, there are, design patterns, there's whole, books and probably college courses and degrees and design patterns and whatnot. I don't know what, for those of you who have experience with that, I mean, does this relate at all to that?
It does, certainly. I think, like, in fact, in terms of like UI patterns, it definitely, for me, it's a nice mental model, which is another UX term, but it's like, oh, I get it. I can use this like I do UI patterns, or all the bootstrap things that you can just
Right.
go, oh, here's a calendar widget, yeah. So to me, the pattern metaphor works well.
Yeah, I really like the patterns as well. And that was just probably my most favorite part of the book so far, is just looking at these patterns he's created and trying to, fit them into where I've been doing the service design work that I do in the past. And I've never taken the rigor of trying to define what type of pattern each pattern was, or each interaction was, or service interaction was that I've gone through. So it would be interesting to go back to some of the things that I've done and say, does this really fit the patterns here, or are there things that I feel like are outside of that? And I'd love to take it further and see if I could really turn into more of a pattern library that I could actually throw on a visual map and make it all start to click together, I guess.
Dude, we can do it like those page 54, like start to do some diagrams like that, I think, or 53. But I'm with you. I'm with you there.
Yeah.
You and I need to try to draw some cool shit.
Sounds good.
I was actually kind of thrown off a little bit because I was actually expecting more patterns. Or I was looking for patterns in a system like you say here on page 54. I was expecting page 54 to be in chapter 3, not chapter 2. And because right now, basically the only patterns I see are more labelings, and then you have the circle. And I was like, I thought we were supposed. I was when I see patterns, I've been thinking connecting things and patterns, systems, and that's not what I was expecting. So I was a little lost. I kept on looking for where's this pattern they keep on talking about? They're just talking about requirements to match the abbreviations he gives. So I don't know.
No, but those are patterns on page 72.
Yeah.
I have
So like on page 54 in that section, I mean that
criteria,
is those aren't really showing the patterns. That's more I think because they're labeled as X and Y, basically it's the affordances and performances. When you get to, I mean, it really gets into the patterns on page 72.
Yeah, it says patterns, but I just don't see how that's a pattern, I guess. Other than the pattern the shape meets this requirement.
You have to talk over us or you'll never get in.
No. That's fine. I'll wait for Matthew to complete. That's fine.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay, no. So I haven't read the book, but I've been just following the discussions with great interest. And my question here is like, we were talking about like, people having subjective experiences, like, if someone watches Netflix based on their specific behaviors, and then they're going to be, that person's going to be exposed to a different screen versus someone else who's watched some other Netflix serial or whatever, TV show, whatever. So my question is like, if people have subjective experiences, then how does that play into the patterns and services? Patterns is trying to find that common strand or a common thread as exposed by services, but a user, I mean, could have subjective experiences. So how does that play? I mean, I know I'm throwing out a very broad question, but just wanted to hear thoughts on that.
I think from what I can tell, the patterns aren't, the patterns themselves don't get into that level of detail. I mean, that would be more of the implementation of the design in terms of that's where you get more into the UX research and down into that. The patterns really give you just a way to frame what it is that you're trying to do, right? It frames the why, I guess. The why are you providing this service? And an example, I mean, completely different from Netflix, but an example that I was working on for my day job was, I work with the U.S. Department of Defense, right? So one of the questions was, well, how do we get electric vehicle charging stations on military installations, right? What would be involved in doing that? And so you think about, well, what is an EV charging station? Well, it's basically a gas station, right? But for electric cars. And so the basic pattern for those two things is very similar, right? But then, so you can use that as your starting point. And then as you dig into it and you do the research, you find the differences. Gas stations, you pull in, you fill up, you pull out. An EV charging station, you pull in, you wait an hour, and then you pull out, right? So there's a little bit of a different context, but that basic pattern, gives you a framework from which to start. And depending on how large your enterprise is, right? When you decide you want to, offer a new service, if you have this design pattern library for your company, you could say, for example, and I've got one here, you can say, oh, well, we want to do something and it's it's of a pattern CH6EE1. What else do we have in our portfolio that is that pattern? And then you can look through your database and do that. So that all builds to that, right? I mean, the patterns themselves on an individual service don't offer that much value. But once you start scaling and you have a lot of them, then you use that analogical reasoning to, help you be more effective, more efficient, and get to what you need quicker.
Thank you, Brett. This is very helpful.
Okay.
That's very interesting, Brett, what you just said about kind of a database of the different patterns and using those different labels.
Mm-hmm.
So in talking to Majid, is that like where he's going? Is like machine learning of service design?
Yeah, it's well, I think machine learning is on the horizon, and if y'all are interested, he is actually working on a pattern. They're putting together basically an open source pattern library, trying to basically think of all the services that you encounter during the day and coding it, and they're using Airtable to put it into this big database of things, and they actually have a Slack. It's called Design Coders, where he works on this and a few other things. But that is exactly where he's going, and his idea is to be able to say, this is what we're doing, show me all of the services in the database that follow this pattern, so that we can just copy it if that's appropriate, or we can use it as the starting point to then iterate and innovate to make it better.
Mm-hmm. Which that would be just like version 1.0 is what you're saying, is pull up the database and look at other services. That's still kind of a human component of evaluating them. But if you take that further into prediction,
right. Yeah.
and true AI and true machine learning, then it's doing it all for you.
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
or it
no,
lets you focus on the other stuff, right? The messy stuff,
right.
The people,
mm-hmm.
or
Well, and Majid is very. I mean, he's his company. I don't know if he has an actual company, but his email address is designcode.org, right? I mean, his intent, putting this together in these patterns, and as we get into the frames in part 2, mm-hmm. Is very much to turn this into code. I mean, he wants to be able to express, a design strategy as code instead of, maps or whatever. And then from that you would, so this gives you the strategic vision for your designs. And then you would go into, like Lois said, the valuable stuff of working with the people and mapping out and doing the research to figure out exactly how to implement, what it is that you're going to do.
Chapter 3 actually made more sense once you said this is the code to make this is more like, to me, this is the code to make the design, to design your service. So that makes more sense than saying this is the design for the service. Here's the design template
right.
for the service. No, this is the code for the template to design your service.
Right.
That makes more sense here. That makes more sense when I'm looking at, the EE1, MP2. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the code that you would use to design your service, this is not the, I guess you could argue it's the design of the code, but it just makes more
right.
sense that way.
Yeah.
When I see patterns in design, I'm like, that's not a pattern, that's a code, that's a criteria.
Right.
But that makes more sense that way.
All right. Cool. So we're getting close to the 7 o'clock end time, and I know we had talked about breaking out and sharing a service and looking at it. I copied an example of something from I don't remember where I got it, something that Majid had sent me probably about medical imaging, and showing how medical imaging as a service offering is composed of multiple microservices. And in this case, there's just 3 of them. I'm sure there's more than 3 in there. Lois, you said you had prepared one.
I did one.
You want to go ahead and...
All right. So let's see. I don't know if I can paste it into that or not. I'll try, though. Let me see what happens.
Okay.
Do you know, Matt, if I just take a copy out of like a Google spreadsheet, will it paste it in a table?
Into Mural? Should.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So
you must be the anonymous giraffe.
I am the anonymous giraffe.
All right.
I don't know here. Let's see. Okay. Let's see what happens.
Well, if you just, yep.
There you go.
All right. So if we think of a service as satisfying a set of needs, I've been doing a lot of work for the nonprofit Alcoholics Anonymous. They have a new app that they've released that helps people find AA meetings all over the world. And so I tried to break all that down. Well, let's see, is this showing up correct? Yeah, so some things I wasn't even sure of. And then, well, it didn't come across very well because in the spreadsheet, these were in columns. But I did try to break them down into pairs, right, with the patterns. And I was struggling, like, okay, this right here, submitting the app and storing the app, is the app store. So I was like, okay, well, this app actually relies on the app store for marketing and stuff, and that's a whole service in and of itself,
Sure.
right? But at least what I had to help the team do was, get it through Apple approvals and Google Play Store approvals, right? Okay, so then TT, and I'm still not sure I got the right patterns on these, right?
Well, and the patterns are very subjective sometimes.
Yeah. But I mean, I did find what I liked is that, like, at least in that one circle on page 75, you could go, okay, like, I'm pretty sure this is TT. So then what is the normal opposite of TT, right? Which was kind of cool. So these two, aggregating disparate meeting listings, and I had stuck off to the side, this is an automation thing, and then display and dispense is providing aggregate meeting listings. So if you think of AA as a franchise, there's every city collects their meetings however they want. In the past, they only offered meetings for that locale, whatever it is. What happens now is the app has an API. So this is the API part. It aggregates the meetings and then provides aggregate meeting listings. So I don't know, that's a service, right? An API is grabbing the things.
Right.
And this one, I wasn't sure what it is. So the local entities provide a service by enter their local meetings. And then there is this verification, which is interesting, right? That the app does, which is the feed live, right? So there's like a MP kind of component, which is maintain, protect, which is kind of interesting. So in order for the app to provide accurate data and provide a decent experience, there's a system that checks to make sure that those meetings are actually live. They're so that's that part. CC, this was tricky too. Like, I kept going back to DD. DD is easy for me, right? Yeah. Display dispense, I'm like, okay, I know that's what happens, but
it's a very common pattern.
Yeah, so DD was easy. So then what happens now? So now this is the sort of the pair that makes sure the data gets in there and that the data is accurate. This first one was the API. Again, I think of these as things still.
Right.
So I was trying to write them as service. So now we're at the actual app. You get the app from the App Store, and the user searches for meetings, and then the app displays the meetings.
Yeah, and so just
right.
Yeah, just one thing on this one, the way the patterns are broken down, and the numbers are actually a part of the code. So it would be like EE1 and TT4 instead of just the letters, and that it's important. It helps you more easily see which ones are performances and which ones are performances, or performances and affordances. Because 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4 are performances. 5, 6, 7, and 8 are affordances, right? And so when you're putting it together, like you said, that diagram on page 75 is a good one to help you see that. So for example, yours where you have CC searching meetings and DD displaying meetings, those two patterns would never go together in a
Oh, because
stereotype.
CC is a 5.
Right, because they're both affordances.
All right, you guys help me with that one then. What would it be? So, and again, this is where like level of detail was tricky for me.
Yeah, so,
Because
yeah.
you've got this app, it's a service. One of the things it does, I mean, the main thing it does is allows people to search for meetings, and it conveys that. That's why I thought it was conduct connect. You know, it displays the meetings, right?
Yeah, I would put EE1, examine, evaluate, right? Because
for CC5.
Yeah, instead of CC5,
okay.
EE1.
Yep. All right.
I think that's really the only one it could be if it's 1 through 4.
Right.
Right. Yeah. If I get forced down there.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, and that's a point he does make, is that once you've picked one of the patterns in the stereotype, you have by definition limited your options for the other pattern. Because
all right, so help me with this one then. If this is MP2, because what it's doing is verifying that those meetings are actually, there's live somewhere. What is the, I don't know, maybe this isn't, these are people who are performing a service of putting that data into a place where the system can verify. So if
I would say maybe
what is the opposite normally of MP is CH.
yeah, see, I would almost go with DD8, just because once you verified that it's live, you verify it's live and then you display it.
I think it could actually be CH though. I'm going to say CH6 here.
All right.
But again, it's like this is all esoteric, right? You're just like diagramming a sentence. It's more important what the sentence says. But I was working on it. Okay, so I think I'm getting to the numbers, or you guys can get there. So that's right, searching and displaying. And then also there's requesting directions. Again, this was like, I was like, I don't know, this is all in-app, right? But there is that map API, right? Which is like a conveyance or whatever, the Google Map API. So I thought that was interesting. So I called that TT, which is transform and translate, because it does, right? You use a Google Map API for directions, and then DD is 8. And then, oh, so this got interesting because this got into the agency problem. So then if you think about this app as a service, it's got a way for members to email. And that's a whole other thing that I've been dealing with, is setting up like a customer support like tool to ingest the email and receive it. So this is part of the service, right? The part that the users don't pay for, but that has a cost, is that whole customer service. And it also involves the agency problem. So receiving queries is what the tool does. But now, see, I'm going to get in trouble again, because is EE? Oh no, yeah, I'm good. EE is 1. That's a human. So receives queries, responds to queries, and then MP and RR. Was I right on that RR? Nope. That would be 2 together. Okay, so then the final part of the service is developers are making sure that it's up to date, and then they update the app back through the App Store. But I guess that's not, I mean, restore repair is this whole thing. So I don't know what the other one would be. Anyway, it was hard.
Yeah, well, it's very hard, and
it looks horrible like this too. I wish I could have pasted my tables in.
And so I pasted into, or I uploaded into the Slack, in the book club channel on the Slack, a document. I think it's a PDF or whatever, but it's that's where I got the medical imaging example for. And
yeah. Well, somebody else's.
Yeah, and so when you look at it, that's something that Majid provided. And actually, during the 2-day training, what he does is he gives you the sheet, and it would say medical imaging, and then it would have the 3 patterns, but without the code, right? And so the first step is you look at this, you say medical imaging, okay, hosting patient, scanning area of interest. You know, which one is the performance and which one is the affordance, right? Just to kind of get to that point. And then once you've figured out which one you think is the performance and which is affordance, then you look at it and say, okay, this is the performance. So which of the 4 patterns, you know, codes would it be? And so that kind of helps you.
Yeah, that might have helped me.
Yeah, iterate down through it. But I mean, I love what you did in taking that and thinking through it and applying these things. But so I uploaded just the one that has the final answers with those. I mean, you know, as an exercise, if you wanted to try, you know, just go through and fill it out. I can tell you during the training when we did this, some of them are pretty straightforward. I mean, some of them are kind of obvious, but then some of them are like, no, that's a performance. No, that's an affordance. No, but that has to be an affordance because this other one's performance. Well, I think that's EE1. No, I think it's TT4, right? And so there's a lot of subjectivity to it, especially when you get into some of the more abstract kind of things.
Well, just figuring out the ing-thing relationships.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like, so I found that kind of tricky.
Yeah. It definitely takes a lot of practice and work and digging into it. Definitely something beyond the scope of a 1 hour Zoom where we're just.
Well, did anybody else do it? Get off me and see if anybody else did it.
No.
I don't know. I picked on you because I knew that you did it because you said you did it.
I did it. It was hard though.
I wanted to do one on grocery shopping because we all kind of seem to be running to the grocery store lately.
Yeah.
But yeah, can't get around to that.
Put it up here. That's extra credit. You have to put it in then.
Put it in where?
Put it in the mural when you're
done. If you have one, go ahead.
Put it in the mural. I got you. Yeah. I need to practice this because I'm still back at affordance performance and trying to remember the differences. Yeah. So.
And that will. I mean, that leads us like into the for the next get together. I mean, if you all are interested in doing another, meeting next month where we go through the next chapter and do this. I mean, I love talking with people about this and trying to figure it out. So we can go ahead and plan on doing that. We'll do part 2 next time. Part 2 is, part 2 is the heart. I mean, it's the meat of the book. Part 1 here has really been just kind of setting up the basic ideas. And so next time, there's 4 chapters where he talks about 4 promises, promises, factors, elements, and then frames. And ultimately I don't know if you've read that far, but so you've got, so you have, in a pattern, you have an affordance and a performance, right? Each affordance and performance has supply and demand. Those are your 4 promises. And then within that, there's different factors to consider, the who, why, what, and how. And then when you get to the end, once you've taken one of these stereotypes, what you have is a 16 square frame, right? A 4x4 16x frame that includes 16 sentences, one for each box in the frame, that Majid claims defines your service, right? So it's basically a 16 sentence code that describes is the design for what your service is or what it's going to be. And then from there, that's where you go into your research and your blueprinting and your journey mapping and all of that to actually bring it to fruition. And so if you think your mind was blown by chapter 3 here with the patterns, it gets really crazy in the next part. And so we will plan on doing that. Does the first Wednesday of May, whatever day that would be, work there for everyone, just to kind of stay on the same pattern? So that would be Wednesday, May the 6th.
Yeah, it looks like things we're all going to be here anyway.
Yeah, that works. We'll all still be in the house.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll change.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Thanks for hosting, Brett.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you all
thanks.
for joining.
But
Like I said, I've enjoyed the chance to talk to other people who are trying to figure this out.
oh yeah, this is talking about this actually. I'm starting to see how the first half of this tool is going to be used, which is nice. I don't think I would have figured it out just sitting here reading it. So
I like learning with you guys. It's fun.
Yeah.
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 All right, but
All
I'm
right.
out of here now. I'm hungry.
Yep. So May the
No
6th,
pizza.
I'll schedule something for that. And if any of you want to talk about this like between now and then, or just whatever, and want to chat because you can't get out and see people, give me a call.
Bye, Brett.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.
All right. See ya.
See ya.